I knew about his second family for 14 months before he knew I knew. 14 months of sleeping next to him. 14 months of passing the salt at dinner. 14 months of asking about his day. Of watching him check his phone under the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. He had been lying for so long, he had forgotten what the truth felt like. I knew exactly who he was. And I chose, on purpose, to say nothing. People ask me how I did it. How I stayed quiet. How I sat at our kitchen table every single morning, the table we picked out together at an estate sale back in 2011, the one with a small burn mark on the corner from a candle I knocked over the winter my mother was sick, how I sat there and poured his coffee and said nothing. The answer is simple. It just doesn't make me sound like a warm person. I was building something. And I was not going to let him see me coming. His name was Stellan. We had been married 11 years when I found out. We were together for 3 years before that. 14 years total, if you count from the beginning. I do. I count everything now. We met in our late 20s. A birthday party for a mutual friend. The way a lot of people meet. He was funny. He was also good at paying attention, better than most men I had known. He remembered small things. The name of my college roommate I had mentioned once. The coffee order I gave a barista and a story I told in passing. I thought that was love. Now I know it was a skill. From the outside, we looked like a solid couple. We bought a house in 2014. 3 bedrooms in a neighborhood we had to stretch a little to afford. We had a shared checking account, a shared savings account, and a shared investment account that Stellan managed because he worked in finance. I trusted him with the numbers. We had a dog. A big-headed rescue mutt named Birch, who slept at the foot of our bed and sometimes sat between us on the couch, as if he could feel something we were not ready to name. We did not have children. We had tried for 2 years in our mid-30s. We went to appointments. Tracked calendars. Hoped. And then, quietly and without a lot of drama, we decided that the life we had was enough. That was one of the things I had loved about us. We could make hard decisions together without falling apart. I thought I had loved that about us. The distance started around year 8. I have learned since then that this is common. 2 people stop choosing each other every day, and instead they just exist in the same house. They stop fighting. At first that feels like peace. Eventually you understand it is just distance with good manners. Stellan started coming home later. Not in a dramatic way. Not every night. Just often enough that dinner was usually me and Birch. He would eat whatever I left on the stove, and we would sit together for maybe 30 minutes before he said he had to catch up on work. His phone started living face down on every table in the house. He started running on Saturday mornings. I encouraged it. I thought it was healthy. I was not suspicious yet. I was just a woman in a long marriage who had started mixing up the absence of worry with the presence of trust. Then he started managing the people around me. Carefully. Quietly. He would mention, as if in passing, that my friend Renata had seemed a little off lately. I just worry about her, honestly. She doesn't seem very stable. He said it with the face of a caring husband. And I, because I still trusted his read on people, would find myself slightly cooler at my next lunch with Renata. He did the same thing with my sister. Small comments. Nothing that sounded like an attack. Just seeds. She said something strange when I ran into her at the pharmacy. I didn't want to bring it up, but he let the sentence hang there and do its work. He was building something, I understand now. Not a messy plan. A careful one. He was creating a version of me in the minds of the people around us. A woman who was a little too sensitive. A woman who sometimes got things wrong. The kind of person whose side of the story should be heard with a little extra caution. He was not doing this loudly. He was doing it like water wears down stone. drop by drop, over years, until the shape of the surface changes so slowly that no one can say when it happened. He did it in public too. At dinner parties, he liked to tell stories about times I had overreacted. Always with a warm smile. Always framed as a husband gently teasing his wife. Claire does this thing where she... And then a laugh, and everyone at the table laughing with him, and me laughing too. Because the story was just close enough to something that had happened, and to object would make me look like exactly the person he was describing. I laughed every time. And every time I did, I gave him a little more of my credibility. If I brought something up, a late night, a charge I didn't recognize on the credit card, the way he had turned his phone over after laughing at a text, he had a way of responding that was almost surgical. He would not get defensive. He would get sad. He would let out a slow sigh. The specific sigh of a patient man dealing with an unreasonable woman. And then he would say something like, "I don't know what to tell you, Claire. I feel like you're always waiting for me to do something wrong." Then he would wait. He would let the silence sit between us until I felt it pressing on my skin. Until I said something to fill it. Something that sounded, even to my own ears, like an apology. Once I apologized. He said quietly that he appreciated it. Then he hugged me. Standing in our kitchen, the man who had a second home 45 minutes away held me close and said he just wanted us to be okay. I think about that hug more than I want to. I am not someone who second-guesses herself easily. I built a career in contract law on one belief, that language means what it says, that vague wording is never an accident, and that the most dangerous part of any document is what is missing. And yet, over several years, Stellan had talked me into believing my own instincts were a flaw. That I was the kind of person who looked for trouble. That if I was not careful, I would push everyone away. The cruelest part of that kind of control is how clean it is. He never called me crazy. He never said the word unstable to my face. He just built a world where my worries always seemed a little too big. My feelings always a little too much. And I, a woman whose whole career was built on being precise, found myself questioning my own sense of what was real. That is a very specific kind of harm. It does not leave a mark you can point to. I found out because of an insurance form. That surprises people. They expect a cliché. A hotel receipt. A phone left unlocked. A late-night call I was not supposed to hear. But the truth arrived on a Tuesday afternoon as a letter from our health insurance company. It was addressed to Stellan. It had been forwarded from an address I did not recognize. All our mail went to the house. This letter had been rerouted from somewhere else. I opened it because it was insurance business, the kind of thing that needs attention, and Stellan was at work. It was a notice about a change to our coverage. A list of who was covered under the plan. Stellan and I were on it. We had no children. There were no other dependents. But this letter listed a dependent. A child. 6 years old. At a second address in a county 45 minutes from our house. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. I put it down on the kitchen counter. I stood there with both hands flat on the laminate. The fridge was humming. Birch was asleep in a square of afternoon sun by the back door. And the world I had been living inside rearranged itself around me in the time it takes to read 23 words. A child. 6 years old. A second address. I folded the letter exactly as it had been folded. Slid it back in the envelope. Placed it on the counter where Stellan left his keys. Then I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room that still smelled like his cologne. And I felt the floor drop out from under the last 11 years. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment. It was not rage. Not yet. It was more like suddenly understanding a sentence in a language you thought you did not speak. Everything rearranged. The late nights. The phone face down. The patient sighs. The careful way he had made me feel like the problem in my own marriage. It all locked into the same terrible shape. I did not cry. I sat with it for 20 minutes. Then I went downstairs, moved the letter to a different spot on the counter so it would look undisturbed, and I started making dinner. When he came home that evening, he picked up the letter, looked at it, and said, "Insurance nonsense. I'll call them tomorrow." He put it in his work bag. I said, How was traffic?" That was the first night of the 14 months. In the weeks that followed, I did what my training had always taught me to do. Gather the facts before you move. I did not act on instinct. I did not confront him. I did not cry at him. I set up a separate email account on an old laptop he did not know about, one I had kept in a box in the guest room closet. And I started building a file. It was not hard once I knew where to look. The second address on the insurance letter was a starting point. A search of public property records confirmed it. A rental house, with Stellan's name on the lease, in a town called Delwood. The lease had started 4 years ago. 4 years. The child was 6. I ran the math more than once, as if the numbers might change. They did not. That meant this other life had started, had been created, literally, during the same time Stellan and I were trying to have a child together. We had been going to appointments, tracking calendars, sitting in waiting rooms, being open with each other in the tired, tender way of two people who want something they are struggling to get. He had been doing that with me on weekends and building another home on weekdays. And I had cried in his arms once, after a negative test, and he had held me and said we would figure it out together. I stayed very still when that landed. I filed it away. I would not open it again until I needed it. Her name was Diane. I found that out through a tax form. Stellan handled our shared tax filing, but I had access to the account. I started reading everything I had left to him before. There were deductions I did not recognize. A child care credit, filed on a return I had signed without looking closely, because Stellan always said he had taken care of it. I had been the kind of wife who let her husband handle the money because he worked in finance and he knew what he was doing. I had been, I now understood, exactly the kind of wife he needed me to be. Diane was 31. She worked as a dental hygienist. She had a daughter named Sophie, 6 years old, who had Stellan's exact wide forehead and his slightly cleft chin. I found Diane on social media 3 weeks in. Her personal account was private, but her work page was public. A shared contact from Stellan's office had left a comment on one of her posts. That is how the app pointed me to her, through a second account I had made. She had photos with Sophie. Beach days. A birthday party with streamers and a unicorn cake. In several of them, just out of frame, you could see a man's arm. The watch on his wrist was one I had given Stellan for our 8th anniversary. I stared at that watch for longer than I want to admit. She believed she was the real story. I could see it immediately. The way she posted. The normal, steady rhythm of it, beach days and birthday cakes, this was not a woman who thought of herself as a secret. She was a woman who had been told, I was sure, that she was the real one. That my marriage was something left over. An old arrangement being quietly put to rest. He would have told her I was difficult. Unstable. That things between us had been over for years in every way that mattered. He would have said he was staying for practical reasons. Financial ones. That he was waiting for the right time. That he was protecting everyone in the meantime. He had that vocabulary. I had heard him use parts of it on me, the careful language of a man who is very good at making the woman in front of him feel like she is the only reasonable choice he has left. He was running 2 homes and 2 stories at the same time. And in both of them, he was the reasonable one. Diane had a 6-year-old daughter, a rental house, and a man who showed up on a regular schedule. He brought groceries. He fixed things when they broke. He took Sophie to the park on Sunday mornings, the same Sunday mornings he told me he was running. Diane believed him. Why would she not? He was good at this. He had spent years getting good at this. I want to stop here for a moment, because I think this part is often misunderstood. People hear that I stayed quiet and they think I was waiting around. I was not. Staying quiet and staying still are two different things. One means you are doing nothing. The other means you are moving where no one can see you. I hired a lawyer. Not the first name I found online, the second. A woman named Patricia Osei, who worked on divorce cases with complex finances. 3 separate reviews mentioned her ability to find money that had been moved or hidden. I met with her on a Thursday when Stellan thought I was at lunch with a colleague. I brought copies of everything I had. She spread the papers across her desk and read. Then she looked up at me. "He's been running 2 financial lives," she said. The rental. The child care credit. The second address on the insurance. This is all documented. It can all be traced. I know, I said. I want to wait. She looked at me. For what? He has stock options that vest in 8 months. A company grant from 4 years ago. There is also a performance bonus that will likely pay out in the spring. And our mortgage will have enough equity by the end of the year. Patricia set down her pen and studied me for a moment. Okay, she said. Then we wait. I went home and made dinner. Waiting, when you do it this way, takes a kind of discipline most people do not have a name for. It is not passive. Every single day, I made an active choice not to act. I made that choice at breakfast. I made it at dinner. I made it at 11:30 at night, lying next to Stellan in the dark, running numbers in my head. Equity timelines. Vesting schedules. The cost of moving too soon versus the value of staying still a little longer. I kept the documents in a fireproof box at my office. Never at home. I was careful about what I printed and when. I used the old laptop only for anything connected to the case. I kept my phone habits completely normal. The same apps. The same patterns. Nothing that would raise a question. And I watched him. I watched him perform. That is the only word that fits. Stellan was always performing, I now understood. The devoted husband. The steady earner. The patient man in a slightly imperfect marriage who still showed up and remembered birthdays. He had been doing it for years. For me some days, for Diane on others. The same basic role, adjusted for 2 different audiences, playing in 2 different rooms. There is something almost impressive about that. But the sadness it carries is his, not mine. He told me once, during this period, that he was worried I had gone quiet. "You seem far away lately," he said. "I don't know where you go." I smiled. I told him I was tired. Work had been stressful. He nodded. He believed it because he needed to believe it. He started paying me more attention. Flowers, twice. A suggestion of a weekend trip, which I turned down warmly. He started coming home earlier. Whether that was genuine guilt or whether some part of him sensed a shift he could not name, I cannot say. What I can say is that the extra attention felt exactly like what it was. He was managing an unnamed threat. He was running his usual program. I almost confronted him that night. I almost put the whole file on the table. The lease. The insurance letter. The tax forms. The photo of Sophie with his forehead and his chin. My hand was on the folder in my work bag. But I thought about the stock options. The bonus. The equity. I thought about what Patricia had said. I thought about the difference between a woman who is angry and a woman who is prepared. I put the folder back. A confrontation would feel good for maybe 90 seconds. Being prepared would protect me for the rest of my life. He kissed my temple before he went to sleep. I lay still and thought about timelines. In month 9, something changed. A financial alert I had set on a flagged account told me that Stellan had moved a large amount of money from our shared investment account into one I had no access to. What he did was technically legal at that point. We were still married. The account was jointly held. He had the right. But the amount was large enough to tell me something important. He was getting ready to leave. And he was planning to do it his way. I called Patricia from my car in a parking garage 3 blocks from my office. "He's moving money," I said. "How much?" I told her. There was a pause. Then we move faster. We did. Over the next 6 weeks, I took careful, legal steps to protect myself. Patricia filed paperwork that would establish a clear record of the money trail if we went to court. She flagged the transferred funds for recovery. She also noted that a dependent had been claimed on our shared tax returns without my knowledge. That opened a separate question about tax fraud. One I had not acted on yet, that now sat quietly on the table like a knife set down very gently. I came home from that meeting and made pasta. Stellan was already there. He said it smelled good. I said thank you. There was one more thing I had been preparing for even longer. Stellan's company included a conduct clause in the contracts of everyone at the director level or above. I knew this because Stellan had mentioned it once, years earlier, while complaining about a colleague who had been let go for reasons that were never stated publicly. The clause was real. I had confirmed it through a copy of the employee handbook Stellan had brought home years before, one of those documents that ends up in a file cabinet and is never thought about again. Until it is. Stellan was set to be honored at the company's annual leadership dinner in March. It was a big event. The end of a promotion cycle he had been working toward for 3 years. His name would be announced. His bonus would process the following week. His stock options would vest the week after that. I bought a new dress. Deep green. Simple. Well made. The kind of dress a loyal wife wears to celebrate her husband. The night of the dinner, I dressed with care. I wore my hair the way Stellan always said he liked it. I drove to the hotel, walked through the lobby, greeted the people I had met over the years at various company events. I smiled. I accepted a glass of champagne. I found my seat. Stellan was already at the table. He stood when he saw me. The gesture was so smooth, so practiced, that a cold kind of calm moved through me like water. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you," I said. I kissed his cheek. Dinner was served. Awards were given. Stellan received his. Applause, a handshake from the CEO, a photo I smiled in from my seat. He came back to the table with the look men get when they believe they have handled everything. I waited until the dessert plates were being cleared. Then I said, quietly, to the colleague sitting to Stellan's left, a senior HR director named James, who had worked at the company for 15 years and whom I had spoken to exactly twice before, "James, I wanted to ask you something. About the conduct clause in your director contracts. I was wondering whether an undisclosed dependent and a second household would fall under that clause, or whether there is a separate process for financial disclosure issues." I said it the way you ask about where the parking vouchers are. No raised voice. No drama. James looked at me. Stellan went very still. "I only ask," I continued, "because I have retained a lawyer, and she asked me to understand the professional side of things before our divorce filing becomes public. I would not want there to be any surprises." I took a small sip of water. I imagine HR would want a heads up. For seconds of silence at that corner of the table. It felt much longer. Stellan said my name. Just my name. In a tone I recognized, the beginning of his usual sequence. The setup for the sad face. The patient sigh. The suggestion that I was making things bigger than they were. I looked at him with complete calm and said, "Don't." "One word." Said softly. He stopped. I excused myself from the table. I said warm goodbyes to the people I passed. I walked through the lobby and out into the night air. I sat in my car for a while and thought about Birch, probably asleep at the foot of the bed. I thought about the burn mark on the kitchen table. I thought about a version of my life that was ending in the most planned way I could have arranged. The divorce was filed the following Monday. Stellan was served at the office. I know because his assistant called me. Not officially, but personally, the way someone calls when they have been close enough to a situation that the human part of them takes over. She said she was sorry. I thanked her. He called me 17 minutes after being served. I let it go to voicemail. His voice in the message was controlled but not quite steady. He said we needed to talk. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said he was asking me, please, to let him explain before anything else happened. I listened to the message once. I saved it for the record. Then I called Patricia. The financial proceedings took 7 months. Patricia was good, better than good. The money Stellan had moved was identified and brought back into the divorce settlement. His lawyer was capable. Ours was sharper. The second home, the hidden dependent, the 4 years of living 2 lives at once, all of it became part of the official record. The tax issue alone required its own separate process that I was advised not to discuss publicly. I sat in a number of rooms under bright fluorescent lights and said very little. I let the documents do the talking. That is what documents are for. The stock options, which had vested the week before I filed, were part of our shared estate. The bonus, which had processed 3 days earlier, was too. These were not accidents. Stellan's lawyer argued that the options and the bonus should be treated separately, as future pay, not shared money. Patricia had been waiting for that argument. She had been ready for it since month 2. She was prepared in a way that made clear she had never expected a different conversation. When the division was final, the numbers told a clear story. Stellan left that marriage in a much weaker position than the one he had spent 4 years quietly setting up for himself. It was not an extreme result. It was an accurate one. The conduct clause at Stellan's company was reviewed. I do not know exactly what was said in those meetings, I was not part of them. What I know is that his promotion was pulled within 3 weeks of the dinner. He kept a lower-level position for 4 more months, then resigned. The company said it was a mutual decision. The people who had been in that dining room understood it differently. What Stellan had not expected. Because he had built his work reputation on the same ground he had built everything else, and it had never occurred to him that the two were connected, was how fast credibility disappears once it starts to go. A reputation is not a wall. It is a temperature. When it drops everywhere at once. Old clients stopped calling back with the same speed. Meetings that used to happen easily now needed a follow-up, then another. People in his professional circle went quiet in the way that communities go quiet when they are deciding what to do with someone. He had built his standing on being reliable, steady, trustworthy. A man of his word. And word got out, the way it always does in small professional worlds, that his word was not quite as solid as he had claimed. He tried, in the months that followed, to shape the story. I know this through people we both knew. He told people he was going through a painful separation. He suggested, I have no doubt, that I had chosen to make things public instead of handling them privately. He framed the dinner as a scene I had caused. He was doing what he always did, putting himself at the center of every event as the calm, reasonable man who had been blindsided by an unreasonable woman. But the paperwork was out in the world now. The filing was public record. The second home was documented. The story he had kept alive for years. The devoted husband, the reliable professional, the man who kept it all together, had been checked against the facts. It did not hold up. He could not gaslight a court filing. He could not give a sad sigh to a property record. He could not make a lease agreement feel like an overreaction. Diane found out in stages. I did not tell her. I had no interest in being the one to deliver that news, and I did not need to engineer a confrontation. The divorce was public. The details that came out in the financial case were not private. She was a sharp woman, I had understood that from the care she put into her life in those photos. The full picture was there for anyone who wanted to look. Eventually she looked. What she found was not just that Stellan had a wife. She found that she had been the mirror of me. Another woman who had been handled, reassured, and kept carefully inside a story she had not written and was not allowed to read in full. He had told her I was unstable. That my marriage to him was a formality being wound down. He had told me nothing at all, which was its own kind of lie. He had lied to both of us, but differently. He had tailored each lie to its audience. To me, he said I was too sensitive. Too quick to imagine problems that were not there. To her, he said I was the problem he was protecting her from. We were the same woman inside two different versions of the same false story. She had a child. She had built a life. She had put her trust in a man who showed up often enough to feel solid, and she had made choices based on that trust. Stayed in a rental when she might have bought. Waited when she might have moved on. Kept herself in a kind of quiet holding pattern that only made sense if the future he had implied was real. It was not real. I do not know exactly what happened between them once everything came to light. I know that she stopped appearing at workplace events where she had occasionally shown up before. I know the rental in Delwood was no longer in Stellan's name within 6 months. I know that Sophie's school records, which came up briefly during our proceedings, showed a new emergency contact. I do not need to know more than that. What I do know is that the story Stellan had built for years, the patient, overlooked man managing a hard marriage while working quietly towards something better, collapsed under the weight of its own evidence. There was no version of events left where he was the steady, reasonable one. Both scripts were visible now. The overlap was clear. The man who had spent years making two women feel like they were the complicated part of an otherwise simple situation was now, for the first time, the complicated part himself. He had nothing left to perform. The character he had played for so long was not available anymore. The stage was empty and the lights were on. I kept the house. I kept Birch, who still sleeps at the foot of the bed and who, I believe this, knew something was wrong long before I admitted it. Dogs read rooms in a way people do not. He had been sitting between us on the couch for 2 years before the letter came. I kept the kitchen table with the burn mark on the corner. I started over at 42. That is not the worst age to start over. You know yourself better. You have less tolerance for being handled. You understand, in a way you could not at 28, that being calm is not the same as having no feelings. It is what you arrive at when the feelings have been fully felt and what is left is just clear sight. You stop needing the person who hurt you to admit what they did. You stop waiting for the apology that will make everything make sense. You understand that making sense of it is your job now. That the story is yours to end. People still ask me how I stayed quiet for so long. How I sat at that table every morning and poured his coffee and said nothing. How I kissed him goodbye. How I went to his work events. How I said things like how was traffic and it smells good and I'm just tired for 14 months while a lockbox full of evidence sat in my office. I tell them the truth. I was not being patient. I was being precise. There is a difference. Patience means waiting for something to happen to you. Precision means deciding how things will happen, and then making sure they do. Stellan thought he was managing me. He had been, for longer than I want to say. He was skilled at it. The sighs. The sad eyes. The slow build of small moments meant to make me feel like I was the unreliable one in my own marriage. He had placed himself, in every social circle, every professional setting, every conversation Diane ever had about him, as a good man dealing with a hard situation. He had made himself the reasonable center of every story. He forgot one thing. Or maybe it never crossed his mind at all. The woman he had decided to underestimate was a contract lawyer. A person who read documents for a living. Who understood that the most dangerous part of any agreement is what is left out. Who had spent years waiting for all the evidence before reaching a conclusion. I did not scream at him. I did not throw anything. I did not make a single phone call in anger. I did not tell Renata, or my sister, or anyone who knew us both. I gave him no ammunition. I gave him nothing to point to. No moment to replay. No behavior to describe. The image he had worked to build of me, difficult, suspicious, the kind of woman who creates problems, had nothing to stand on. I had refused to play the role he wrote for me. What I gave him was what he had always wanted from me. Silence. I just made sure that when the silence ended, it ended in a room full of witnesses, with every document already filed, every account already protected, and 14 months of evidence sitting in a folder that Patricia Osei still keeps on a shelf in her office. Not because she needs it. Because I asked her to keep it. He thought he was the one who knew things. He thought he had been careful enough. He thought the story he had built was strong, because it had lasted for years on the fuel of my trust and my habit of looking at other people's problems instead of his. He had been careful. I had been thorough. And thoroughness always wins. There is still a burn mark on the kitchen table. I am not going to sand it out. It was there before him. It is here after him. Every morning when I set my coffee down and look at it, I think about the woman who sat at this table and felt 11 years drop away beneath her, and chose, in that exact moment, with no plan and no instructions, to stay completely still. I chose to know before he knew I knew. I chose to get ready before he realized I was getting ready. I chose the moment, the room, the witnesses, the documents, and the words. One question to an HR director. Said quietly, at a dinner he had spent 3 years working toward, in front of people who will remember it for the rest of their careers. The night he thought was his biggest win turned out to be his last performance. He did not see me coming. He should have known better. He married me.